Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about a man who became the most powerful figure in the Western world and then voluntarily gave it away. Twice. It reveals what happens when extraordinary power falls into the hands of someone who genuinely doesn't want to keep it. How do we measure greatness? By what someone achieves, or by what they choose to refuse? December 14th, 1799, Mount Vernon. The room smells of camphor and sweat and something else. The particular odor of a sick room, of flesh fighting a losing battle. Outside, winter wind tears at the shutters. The Potomac is grey and churning. Inside, in the master bedroom on the second floor, George Washington is dying. He is 67 years old. 2 days ago, he rode for hours inspecting his farms in freezing rain and snow, as he had done nearly every day for 40 years. Yesterday, his throat began to hurt. This morning, he could barely breathe. Now, at 4 in the afternoon, he lies propped up in bed, his massive frame somehow diminished, his breathing labored and wet. His neck is swollen, the skin darkening. 3 doctors hover nearby: James Craik, his friend for decades, Gustavus Brown, and Elisha Dick, the youngest, who keeps arguing against what the others want to do. Martha Washington sits in a chair at the foot of the bed. She is 68, small and quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She has been watching her husband die all day, watching the procedures that are supposed to save him, but that everyone in the room suspects are only hastening the end. She hasn't wept. Not yet. That will come later, in the months and years ahead, when she burns their letters, erasing the private man from history, leaving only the monument. Christopher, an enslaved man who serves as Washington's body servant, stands ready with a bowl. Caroline, one of the house slaves, waits by the door with fresh linens. They have been here all day too, watching, helping, bearing witness to something they cannot fully name. Their legal owner is dying. What that will mean for them, freedom or sale, hope or despair, depends on words in a will they have not read. The doctors are bleeding him again. It's the 4th time today. They have already taken perhaps half his blood. More than 80 ounces drawn away into basins, the physicians operating on the ancient theory that illness resides in corrupt humors that must be drained. Washington submits without complaint, extending his arm, watching his own blood flow. He has always had an almost preternatural ability to endure physical pain in silence. Between the bleedings, they have blistered his throat with cantharides, the dried remains of beetles that raise terrible welts on the skin. They have made him gargle with a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter, nearly choking him. They have applied poultices of wheat bran to draw out the inflammation. Nothing works. His throat continues to swell shut. Around 5 o'clock, Dr. Dick pleads one more time. They should perform a tracheotomy, cut directly into his windpipe to let him breathe. The other doctors refuse. Too dangerous, too experimental. Washington, struggling for air, manages to rasp out words. I thank you for your attentions, but I pray you to take no more trouble about me. Let me go off quietly. But they cannot let him go quietly. They bleed him again. Tobias Lear, Washington's personal secretary, sits at a small desk in the corner, recording everything. His pen scratches across paper, documenting the final hours of the man he has served for 16 years. Later, this document will be published, circulated, analyzed. The nation will want to know how their hero died. They will want to hear that he died well, stoically, as a model for how a great man should exit the world. And Lear will give them that story, carefully edited, appropriately dignified. But in this room, right now, there is nothing dignified about it. There is a man suffocating, drowning in his own inflamed tissue. There are doctors cutting into his arm again and again, watching the blood flow into bowls. There is a wife sitting silent, watching. There are enslaved people waiting at the margins, their futures as uncertain as their master's remaining hours. Washington tries to speak. His voice is barely a whisper, each word an agony of effort. He calls Lear over, gives instructions for his burial. Do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead. He has always feared being buried alive, one of the common terrors of the age. Even now, facing the certainty of death, he plans for the worst possibilities. The light fades from the windows. Someone lights candles. The room fills with shadows that dance and flicker across the walls. The wind outside grows stronger, rattling the glass, howling down the Potomac. In the quarters, the enslaved community waits for news. In Alexandria, 7 miles away, people go about their evening routines, not yet knowing that the most famous man in America is breathing his last. Around 10 o'clock, Washington feels his own pulse. He has done this periodically throughout the day, the physician in him monitoring his own decline with clinical detachment. His fingers rest on his wrist, counting the beats. They are irregular now, faint. He looks at the doctors. I feel myself going, he whispers. I thank you for your attentions, but I pray you to take no more trouble about me. The doctors step back. There is nothing more they can do, and perhaps they know there never was. The treatment, the endless bleeding, the blistering, the torments, has accomplished nothing except to make his dying more painful. Later, medical historians will debate what killed him. Acute epiglottitis, perhaps, or quinsy, or bacterial tracheitis. The bleedings certainly didn't help. They may have hastened the end. But in this moment, diagnosis doesn't matter. What matters is that a man is dying, and he is dying hard. Martha rises from her chair and comes to the bedside. She takes his hand. No one records what she says to him, if she says anything at all. After 40 years of marriage, a union that began as practical arrangement and became something deeper, something that sustained them both through war and peace, through childlessness and public scrutiny, they are allowed this privacy. The observers in the room look away. Washington's breathing becomes more labored. The rattle in his throat grows louder. His chest heaves with the effort of pulling air through the closing passage. Minutes pass. The candles burn lower. The wind shakes the house. Around 10:20, his breathing changes, becomes slower, shallower. His hand, in Martha's, grows still. And then, nothing. No final words of wisdom. No dramatic pronouncement. Just silence and stillness. And the winter wind outside. Dr. Craik leans over, checks for a pulse, finds none. He straightens, looks at Martha. He is gone. Martha Washington nods. She releases her husband's hand, arranges it carefully on his chest. "All is now over," she says quietly. "I shall soon follow him." She doesn't weep, not here, not in front of everyone. She rises, smooths her dress, and leaves the room with perfect composure, the same composure she has maintained through every crisis of her public life. Behind her, the doctors begin to prepare the body. The enslaved servants move to change the linens, to wash the corpse, to perform the intimate final services for a man who owned them. In the hours that follow, word spreads. A rider leaves for Alexandria. By morning, the news will reach Washington City. By week's end, the nation will know. There will be eulogies and funeral processions and black armbands. Napoleon will order 10 days of mourning in France. The British fleet will lower its flags. Henry Lee will pronounce him first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. The myth-making will begin almost immediately, the transformation of a man into marble. But here, now, in this room, there is only a body growing cold, a woman who has lost her husband, servants who have lost their master and don't yet know if they have gained their freedom, and outside, the winter storm, indifferent to human grief, howling down from the north, the man who invented the American presidency, who led the Continental Army to victory, who could have been king but chose to be citizen. That man is gone. What remains is memory and mystery and 1,000 questions about who he really was beneath the legend. But to understand how a Virginia planter became the father of a nation, how a man with such ordinary origins came to embody such extraordinary ideals, we must go back 67 years to a world that no longer exists. We must go to the Virginia frontier in 1732, where a boy is born into a colony clinging to the edge of empire, where ambition and violence and slavery are woven into the very fabric of daily life, where the future first, President of the United States, enters a world that would shape him in ways he could never have imagined. That world is waiting. And so is the story of how George Washington became George Washington. February 22nd, 1732. Pope's Creek Plantation, on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. A child is born to Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. They name him George, after Mary's guardian. He is their first child together, though Augustine already has sons from his first marriage. The baby arrives into a world of tobacco fields and enslaved labor, of ambition and debt, of men trying to carve gentility from wilderness. The plantation house is modest, wood frame, not brick. 4 rooms downstairs, 4 up. Nothing like the great houses of the true Virginia aristocracy. Not Westover, not Carter's Grove, not the palaces that line the James River where the first families hold court. The Washingtons are gentry, certainly. They own land and slaves, but they are middling gentry, always reaching for the next rung of the ladder, never quite arriving. Augustine Washington is a striving man. He owns several plantations, operates an iron forge, trades in land speculation. He sends his 2 oldest sons to England for their education, the mark of true gentility. But money is always uncertain, always slipping through his fingers faster than it accumulates. The iron business loses money, The tobacco prices fluctuate. The debts to English merchants grow. George spends his first 3 years at Pope's Creek. Then the family moves to Little Hunting Creek Plantation, then to Ferry Farm, across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg. Always moving, always trying to improve their position. The boy grows up watching his father scramble, scheme, hope. This is not the childhood of a grandee. This is the childhood of someone who must make his own way. And then, April 12th, 1743, Augustine Washington dies. George is 11 years old. The death changes everything. Lawrence, the eldest son, inherits the best property, Little Hunting Creek, which he will rename Mount Vernon. Augustine, the second son, gets other lands. George, being from the second marriage and still a minor, gets Ferry Farm and some slaves. But his inheritance is modest. More importantly, his father's death ends any possibility of the English education his half-brothers received. There will be no schooling in England, no polishing at the Inns of Court, no grand tour of the continent. Whatever education George Washington receives will happen in Virginia, and it will be fragmentary at best. The boy learns to write, though his spelling remains erratic throughout his life. He learns basic mathematics. He copies out rules of civility, 110 maxims of behavior, things like kill no vermin as fleas, lice, ticks in the sight of others, and when in company, put not your hands to any part of the body not usually discovered. He is learning how to behave like a gentleman, even if he cannot afford to be educated like one. The anxiety of it, knowing the codes, knowing he doesn't fully possess them, will shape everything that follows. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, is a difficult woman, strong-willed, demanding, perpetually dissatisfied. She will live into her 80s, outlasting her husband by 46 years, and she will spend much of that time complaining that George doesn't do enough for her. When he is President of the United States, she will still be sending him letters, requesting money, claiming neglect. Their relationship is complicated, tense. He does his duty by her, but warmth is scarce. Instead, the boy attaches himself to his half-brother Lawrence, 14 years his senior. Lawrence has everything George lacks: polish, connections, military experience. He fought in the War of Jenkins' Ear, sailed to the Caribbean, contracted tuberculosis that will eventually kill him, but gives him, for now, the glamour of the veteran. Lawrence marries Anne Fairfax, daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, and suddenly the door to the highest levels of Virginia society cracks open. The Fairfaxes are everything. Lord Fairfax, living in Virginia, owns more than 5 million acres of land, the entire northern neck between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers. The Fairfax family is cultivated, cosmopolitan, secure in ways the Washingtons can only imagine. And Lawrence, by marrying into them, brings his younger half-brother along. George begins spending time at Belvoir, the Fairfax plantation adjacent to Mount Vernon. He meets Lord Fairfax himself, an eccentric bachelor who fled England to hunt foxes and manage his vast domain. He meets George William Fairfax, who becomes a lifelong friend. And he meets Sally Fairfax, George William's wife, who will haunt him in ways he never fully acknowledges. At Belvoir, the boy from Ferry Farm sees how the great planters live, the books in the library, the conversation at dinner, the easy confidence of people who never doubt their place in the world. He wants it, all of it. But he has no clear path to get there. He is growing, though. By age 15, he is taller than most grown men. By 16, he stands 6 feet 2 or 3 inches, massive in an age when the average man reaches perhaps 5 foot 7. His hands are enormous. Later, people will remark on them constantly, how they engulf a normal hand in greeting. His shoulders are broad, his legs long and muscular from riding. Physically, he is becoming formidable. But what can he do with this body, this ambition, this hunger for recognition? For a younger son without fortune, the options are limited. The church, perhaps, but Washington has no calling. Trade, but that would mean giving up pretensions to gentility. The military, which appeals to him greatly. He dreams of a commission in the British Army, of scarlet uniforms and glory. But commissions require money or connections he doesn't have. The Navy, which Lawrence suggests, and George nearly accepts until his mother refuses permission. What remains is surveying. It's respectable enough, even genteel in its way. It requires mathematics, which he has studied. And in Virginia in the 1740s, with the frontier pushing westward and land speculation running wild, surveyors are needed. Lord Fairfax needs someone to survey his vast holdings in the Shenandoah Valley. Lawrence arranges it. In March 1748, at age 16, George Washington heads west into the wilderness. The journey transforms him. He keeps a journal, recording everything with the meticulous attention to detail that will characterize his entire life. They cross the Blue Ridge Mountains, descend into the Shenandoah Valley. The land is breathtaking, rolling hills, clear streams, forests that stretch to the horizon. But it is also raw, dangerous, barely settled. They sleep on the ground, their straw bedding catching fire one night from sparks. They encounter Indians, and Washington describes them with the fascination and casual racism of his time and class. Their strange language and behavior, how they danced around the fire, how they got drunk on liquor. He bathes in a creek, marvels at a natural curiosity, a spring with water that won't boil meat, records surveying measurements with precision. He is learning the wilderness, how to move through it, how to survive in it, what lies beyond the comfortable settlements of the tidewater. He sees land, vast quantities of land, that could make fortunes for those who claim it first. The surveying trip is ostensibly about measuring Lord Fairfax's holdings, but it's really an education impossibility. Out here, a young man without an inheritance might still become wealthy. Out here, birth matters less than daring. The work is hard. They run chains through tangled underbrush, ford icy streams, mark boundaries in terrain that has never been mapped. Washington proves himself capable, uncomplaining. He earns his pay. The trip nets him his first real money, a doubloon per day. More than that, he earns a reputation for competence. Within months, he is appointed surveyor of Culpeper County at age 17. The position gives him income, status, and, critically, knowledge. Every survey teaches him the land. Every measurement lets him identify the best parcels. He begins buying land himself, small tracts at first, the beginning of what will become a lifetime of Western land speculation. But surveying, for all its utility, is not what he dreams of. When he lies at night under the stars in the Shenandoah, when he sits around campfires with the rough men who push into the wilderness, he thinks of Lawrence in his military uniform. He thinks of glory, of commanding men, of the respect that comes with a commission. He is tall enough now, strong enough, brave enough. He wants to be a soldier. The wilderness is teaching him other things too. It is teaching him about Indians, not as abstractions, but as people who live on this land, who have their own claims and grievances. It is teaching him about distances, about how vast the continent truly is, how the maps drawn in London mean nothing out here where the trees grow thick and the rivers run wild. It is teaching him self-reliance, how to endure discomfort, how to lead men who won't follow someone weak. And it is teaching him ambition, because everywhere he looks, he sees opportunity, land to be claimed, fortunes to be made, a social ladder that might be climbed by someone determined enough, strong enough, lucky enough. He is 16, 17, 18. His father is dead. His mother is difficult. His inheritance is modest. His education is incomplete. But he has his health, his strength, his connections through Lawrence and the Fairfaxes. And he has learned something crucial from his surveying expeditions into the wilderness. The future is not in the settled tidewater, where the great families have already claimed everything worth having. The future is west, beyond the mountains, in land that hasn't yet been divided, in opportunities that haven't yet been seized. He doesn't know it yet, but the boy who rode into the Shenandoah Valley in 1748 is learning the geography that will define his life. These mountains, these rivers, these forests, this is the terrain where he will make his reputation. This is where the provincial surveyor will become a soldier. This is where the soldier will become a revolutionary. This is where the revolutionary will imagine a nation that stretches from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and beyond. But first, there will be blood. The wilderness that looks so beautiful, so full of promise, is also a killing ground. And George Washington is about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. Lawrence Washington is dying. Everyone knows it, though no one says it directly. The cough that started as a minor irritation has become constant, racking, productive of blood. Tuberculosis, consumption, they call it. The white plague that kills more people in the 18th century than any other disease. It consumes from within, slowly, inexorably. There is no cure, only hope for warmer climates, drier air, the possibility that nature might accomplish what medicine cannot. By 1751, Lawrence has tried everything. He has consulted doctors in Williamsburg, in Annapolis. He has taken the waters at Berkeley Springs. Nothing helps. The cough worsens. He grows thinner. And so he decides on a desperate measure. He will sail to Barbados, where the tropical air might restore his failing lungs. He asks George to come with him. George is 19, still surveying, still dreaming of military glory. He has never been more than a few hundred miles from home. The invitation is both adventure and responsibility. Someone must accompany Lawrence, watch over him, help him if the journey proves too difficult. George accepts immediately. September 28, 1751. They board the Success at Alexandria and sailed down the Potomac, out into the Chesapeake, then into the Atlantic. It is George Washington's first and only voyage outside North America. For 37 days, they sail south through waters that grow progressively warmer, more blue. George keeps a journal, recording wind conditions, the appearance of dolphins, flying fish, the daily routines of shipboard life. He is fascinated by everything: the mechanics of sailing, the vast emptiness of the ocean, the gradual transformation of climate. November 3rd, 1751. They arrive at Bridgetown, Barbados. The island is lush, green, suffocatingly hot. Sugar plantations stretch across the landscape, worked by enslaved Africans in numbers that dwarf anything in Virginia. The white population lives in a state of languid elegance and perpetual fear. Elegant because sugar wealth has made them rich. Fearful because they are vastly outnumbered by the people they enslave. The Washington brothers rent lodgings, meet the local gentry, attend dinners and entertainments. George marvels at the tropical fruits, the exotic birds, the palm trees swaying in warm breezes. He visits a fortress, inspects the fortifications with the eye of someone who dreams of military engineering. He goes to the theatre, his first play, a performance he notes in his journal without much commentary. The island enchants him even as it puzzles him. Such wealth, such beauty, built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor. He notices, but draws no particular conclusions. Not yet. Lawrence's health does not improve. If anything, the climate seems to make him worse. The heat is oppressive. The cough continues. After only 7 weeks, he decides to leave for Bermuda, where the climate might be more temperate. George will return to Virginia. There is business to attend to, his surveying work, his own ambitions. But before George can leave, something happens. Something that will mark him for the rest of his life. He wakes one morning in mid-November with a headache. By afternoon, he is feverish. By evening, he is covered in pustules, smallpox. The disease is a scourge, a killer, one of the great levelers of the age. It kills rich and poor alike, though the rich have better nursing and might survive more often. It killed Mary VII of England, Louis XV of France, countless thousands of ordinary people. And now it has George Washington, 19 years old, far from home, lying in a rented room in Barbados while his body erupts in sores. The fever climbs, the pustules spread, face, arms, torso, everywhere. They hurt. They itch unbearably. He must not scratch them, the doctors warn, or the scarring will be worse. But the urge is overwhelming. Days pass in a haze of pain and heat and delirium. He is strong, healthy, young. These things help. But plenty of strong, healthy, young people die of smallpox. For a week, perhaps 2, the outcome is uncertain. And then, slowly, he begins to recover. The fever breaks, the pustules scab over. He will live. But his face, his smooth young face, is now marked, pitted with scars, small craters left by the pox, not terribly disfigured, not monstrous, but visibly scarred. For the rest of his life, anyone who looks closely at George Washington will see the evidence of his brush with mortality in Barbados. Later, much later, This near death will prove a blessing in disguise. Having survived smallpox, he is now immune. During the Revolution, when the disease ravages both armies, Washington will be able to move among sick soldiers without fear. He will order mass inoculation of the Continental Army, a controversial decision that will save countless lives. But in 1751, recovering in Barbados, all he knows is that he has been marked, diminished, scarred. December 22nd, 1751. George sails for home alone. Lawrence stays behind, still seeking a cure that doesn't exist. They will never see each other again. George arrives back in Virginia in late January 1752. He returns to his surveying, but his mind is restless. Lawrence is dying. The military ambitions George harbors depend partly on Lawrence's influence, his connections. What will happen when that influence is gone? July 1752. Lawrence Washington dies at Mount Vernon, age 34. His widow, Anne, inherits the estate. George is named one of the executors of the will, a sign of trust and responsibility. More importantly, the will stipulates that if Anne dies or remarries, and if Lawrence's daughter Sarah dies without heirs, Mount Vernon will pass to George. It's a distant possibility. Sarah is only 4 years old, but it's a possibility. George attends the funeral. He mourns the brother who had been his guide, his exemplar, his connection to the world he wished to enter. The loss is profound, but even in grief, a part of him must calculate. What does this death mean for his prospects, for his future? Within months, he begins to move. He applies for Lawrence's old position as adjutant of Virginia militia, a post that carries both salary and status. He is 20 years old, has no military experience whatsoever, but he has connections through the Fairfax family. In December 1752, he is appointed adjutant for the Southern District of Virginia with the rank of major. The salary is £100 a year. More valuable than the money is the title, the uniform, the opportunity. Major George Washington. He orders his uniform made with exacting specifications. Scarlet coat, gold lace, everything proper to his rank. He studies military manuals, learns drill, practices the bearing and deportment of an officer. He is teaching himself to be what he wants to become, and part of that education involves looking the part. Throughout his life, Washington will be meticulous about appearance, about protocol, about the visual presentation of authority. It starts here, a young man with pox scars on his face and ambition burning in his chest, playing dress-up in a uniform that represents everything he hopes to be. The Virginia society he aspires to join is small, insular, intensely conscious of rank and precedent. At the top stand perhaps 24 great planter families, the Carters, the Byrds, the Randolphs, the Lees. Below them, a slightly larger group of lesser gentry, families like the Washingtons, prosperous but not grand. And below them, the middling farmers, the merchants, the artisans, and finally the enslaved, who outnumber the free in many counties. Social mobility is possible but difficult. Fortunes can be made in land speculation, in tobacco, in marrying well. But true acceptance, true standing, requires more than money. It requires the right connections, the right manners, the right display of genteel accomplishment. Washington has some of this, the Fairfax connection especially, but he lacks the polish of English education, the easy confidence of inherited wealth. He compensates with fierce attention to detail, with studied correctness, with the kind of self-discipline that transforms desire into performance. He wants, quite desperately, to be a gentleman, not just to appear as one, but to be accepted as one by those who are born to it. His ambition is not radical. He doesn't want to overturn the social order. He wants to climb it, to find his place near the top, to be respected by the people he respects. This conservatism, this desire for acceptance within the existing hierarchy, will shape his early life and paradoxically make his later revolutionary role all the more remarkable. But in 1753, at age 21, revolution is unimaginable. What occupies his mind is more immediate: how to advance his military career, how to acquire more land, how to secure his position in Virginia society. And then, opportunity arrives, dressed as danger. The Ohio country, the vast territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains, drained by the Ohio River and its tributaries, is claimed by Virginia, but increasingly occupied by the French. They are building forts, making alliances with Indian nations, asserting control over land that Virginia considers its own. The colony's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, is alarmed. He needs someone to carry a message to the French commander, demanding that France withdraw from British territory. The mission is dangerous. It requires traveling hundreds of miles through wilderness, in winter, through territory controlled by Indians who might be hostile. Whoever goes will face cold, hunger, possible violence. But whoever goes will also gain notice, demonstrate courage, prove themselves worthy of greater responsibility. George Washington volunteers immediately. Of course he does. This is what he has been waiting for. A chance to distinguish himself, to be more than a surveyor with a militia title, to step onto the stage where reputations are made and fortunes won. He is 21 years old. His face bears the scars of smallpox. His brother is dead. His inheritance is uncertain. But he is tall, strong, brave, and hungry for glory. In October 1753, Dinwiddie commissions him to carry the message to the French. Washington begins preparations for the journey. He recruits guides, interpreters, frontiersmen who know the territory. He packs supplies, studies maps, writes his will, just in case. He doesn't know it yet, but he is about to start a world war. The message he carries, the confrontation it will provoke, the events that will follow, these will spiral into the French and Indian War, which will merge with the 7 Years' War in Europe, which will reshape empires and set in motion the chain of events that will lead, improbably, impossibly, to American independence. But right now, in the autumn of 1753, George Washington is simply a young man setting out on his first real adventure, eager to prove himself, to test his courage, to begin the climb toward the respect and recognition he craves. The wilderness is waiting, and so is history. October 31st, 1753. George Washington sets out from Williamsburg carrying Governor Dinwiddie's letter to the French commander in the Ohio country. With him ride Christopher Gist, a veteran frontiersman, Jacob Van Braam, a Dutch interpreter who speaks French, and 4 other men. They are heading into country that few Virginians have seen, carrying a message that everyone knows the French will ignore. But the mission itself is the point. A show of British resolve. An assertion of Virginia's claim to lands it has never actually controlled. The journey is brutal. They travel north and west, crossing the Appalachians, pushing through forests already gripped by early winter. Rain turns to sleet, turns to snow. The horses struggle through freezing streams. At night, they camp in the open or shelter in crude frontier outposts, places with names like Wills Creek and Logstown, barely more than clusters of cabins on the edge of nowhere. Washington meets with Indian leaders. Half King, a Seneca chief, Monocatucha. Others whose alliances will determine whether the Ohio country remains British or falls to France. The Indians are polite, non-committal. They have their own interests, their own calculations. The young Virginian impresses them with his height and bearing, but he is clearly inexperienced, clearly out of his depth in the complex diplomacy of the frontier. December 11th, 1753. Washington reaches Fort Le Boeuf, a French outpost near Lake Erie. He presents Dinwiddie's letter to Captain Jacques, Le Gardeur de Saint-Pierre, the French commander. The letter demands that France withdraw from the Ohio country, acknowledge British sovereignty, cease construction of forts. Saint-Pierre reads it, is polite, offers hospitality. His answer, delivered after a few days, is exactly what everyone expected. A polite refusal. France will not withdraw. The Ohio country is French. The return journey is even worse than the outward trip. Deep winter now. Washington and Gist, traveling ahead of the others, nearly freeze to death crossing the Allegheny River on a makeshift raft. An Indian guide, whether by accident or design, shoots at Washington from close range, misses. They struggle through snow and cold, finally reaching Wills Creek in mid-January 1754. Washington writes his report, detailing the French positions, their strength, their intentions. Dinwiddie publishes it, along with Washington's journal of the expedition. Suddenly, the young major is famous. A colonial newspaper calls him a hero. The report circulates in London. George Washington, age 22, has a reputation. But reputation is not the same as success. The French are still in the Ohio country, still building forts, still threatening Virginia's claims. Dinwiddie decides on a more forceful response. He will send troops to secure the forks of the Ohio, the strategic point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River. A fort there would control the entire region. Washington is promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of one of the regiments being raised. Finally, real military command. Finally, the chance to prove himself in combat. He is ecstatic, ordering new uniforms, drilling troops, preparing for glory. April 1754. Washington marches west with about 160 men. They are poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly supplied. Virginia has promised provisions that don't arrive. The soldiers are mostly farm boys and drifters, more accustomed to plowing fields than marching in formation. But they are what Washington has, and he pushes them forward through the wilderness, toward the forks of the Ohio. Bad news arrives before they get there. The French have already seized the forks. driven out the small Virginia force that was building a fort, and constructed their own fortification, Fort Duquesne. Washington's mission has failed before it really began, but he continues forward anyway, establishing a base camp at a place called Great Meadows. May 28, 1754. Dawn. Washington leads about 40 men through rain-soaked forest, following Indian guides who claim to have spotted a French party nearby. They find the French encamped in a rocky glen, perhaps 35 men under the command of Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville. What happens next is disputed, confused, crucial. The accounts differ. By Washington's version, the French spotted the Virginians, jumped to arms, and a firefight began. By the French version, Jumonville was trying to read a diplomatic message when Washington's troops opened fire without warning. What is certain is this: the fight lasted perhaps 15 minutes. When it ended, 10 Frenchmen were dead, including Jumonville. 21 were captured. Only one escaped to carry word back to Fort Duquesne. And then, here the story becomes very dark. Half King, the Seneca chief allied with Washington, walked up to Jumonville, who was wounded, possibly already dying, and split his skull open with a tomahawk. Other Indians scalped the dead and dying. Washington watched. Did he try to stop it? The sources don't say. What they do say is that he wrote to his brother afterward with disturbing enthusiasm. "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." The French called it murder. Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission, they claimed, carrying a summons similar to the one Washington had delivered to Saint-Pierre. He should have been allowed to speak, to deliver his message. Instead, he was ambushed and killed. The French version might be self-serving propaganda, or it might be true. Washington signed the report that accepted responsibility for Jumonville's death, though he later claimed the translation was faulty, that he didn't understand what he was signing. Whatever the truth, the consequences were immediate. Coulon de Villiers, Jumonville's brother, marched from Fort Duquesne with 600 French soldiers and 100 Indians, intent on vengeance. July 3rd, 1754. They find Washington at Great Meadows, where he has hastily constructed a palisade fort he calls, with unfortunate optimism, Fort Necessity. The fort is poorly sited, in a low area that quickly becomes a muddy swamp when it rains. And it is raining now, pouring, turning the ground to soup. The French and Indians surround the fort, take positions in the woods, and begin firing. Washington's men fire back, but they are trapped, exposed, taking casualties. The rain keeps falling. Ammunition gets wet. By evening, a third of Washington's force is killed or wounded. The situation is hopeless. Coulon de Villiers offers terms. Washington can surrender and march home with his men, taking their weapons but leaving their cannon. There is one condition. Washington must sign a document admitting responsibility for l'assassinat of Jumonville, the assassination. Washington signs. Later, he will claim he didn't understand the French word assassinat, that Van Braam, translating in the rain and darkness, told him it merely meant killing or death. Perhaps that's true, perhaps not. What is certain is that Washington signs a document admitting to murdering a French diplomat, then marches his bedraggled, defeated force back to Virginia. He expects disgrace. Instead, he receives sympathy. The French were stronger, better positioned. No one could have won in those circumstances. Dinwiddie thanks him for his service, and the larger wheels of war begin turning. The fight at Great Meadows escalates tensions between Britain and France. What started as a colonial squabble in the wilderness becomes the spark that ignites a global war. 1755. Britain sends General Edward Braddock with 2 regiments of regular troops to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington, eager to redeem himself, joins as a volunteer aide-de-camp. He has no official rank in the British Army. Colonial officers are not recognized, but he serves on Braddock's staff, advising on wilderness warfare, watching the British professionals prepare their campaign. Braddock is confident, contemptuous of colonials and Indians alike. He leads his force west in traditional European fashion: scarlet columns, drums beating, artillery hauled through the forest on crude roads his men cut as they advance. Washington tries to warn him about frontier tactics, about the danger of ambush. Braddock dismisses the advice. These are British regulars, trained in European warfare. They will crush any French resistance. July 9, 1755, 8 miles from Fort Duquesne. The British column is crossing the Monongahela River when French forces and their Indian allies attack from the woods. It is a massacre. The British, trained to fight in open formation, bunch together, make perfect targets. Officers on horseback are shot down. The men panic, break, run. Braddock himself is mortally wounded. The army disintegrates. Washington is in the middle of it. He is sick with dysentery, can barely sit his horse, but he rides through the chaos, trying to rally the troops. 2 horses are shot out from under him. 4 bullets pierce his coat. Men die all around him. The famous painting made later shows him calm and heroic amid the carnage. The reality is blood and screaming and absolute confusion, but he survives. Again, miraculously. Men who are standing next to him are killed, but Washington rides through the storm of bullets untouched. A Presbyterian minister later writes that Washington was protected by divine providence, preserved for some greater purpose. The legend grows. Washington cannot be killed in battle. He is blessed, chosen, invulnerable. The survivors retreat in chaos. Braddock dies from his wounds. The British regular army, the supposedly invincible professionals, has been destroyed by a smaller force of French and Indians. The frontier is now open to attack. Virginia panics. Washington is appointed colonel and commander of all Virginia forces, charged with defending the frontier. He is 23 years old. For the next 3 years, he tries to hold a line hundreds of miles long with a few hundred men. It is impossible. Settlers are killed, scalped, farmsteads burn. Washington begs for more troops, better supplies, regular commissions for his officers. He receives almost nothing. The British High Command continues to treat colonial officers with contempt. He writes angry letters demanding respect, insisting on proper military protocol. He is learning to hate British condescension toward Americans. The war drags on. Small skirmishes, raids, occasional larger battles. Washington's reputation continues to grow, but his frustration mounts. He wants a commission in the regular British Army. the respect and status that comes with it. He applies repeatedly. He is always refused. The message is clear. Colonials, no matter how capable, are not equals. 1758. A new expedition against Fort Duquesne, this time under General John Forbes. Washington commands Virginia troops attached to the expedition. Forbes is methodical, cautious, cutting roads, building supply depots, advancing slowly. Washington chafes at the pace. He wants decisive action, quick victory. November 1758. The British finally reach Fort Duquesne. The French, outnumbered and facing inevitable defeat, blow up the fort and retreat. The British occupy the ruins, rename the site Pittsburgh. The Ohio country is won. For Washington, this should be triumph. Instead, it feels empty. He has spent 4 years fighting in wilderness, seen men die, killed enemies, earned fame. But he has not received the one thing he truly wanted: acceptance as an equal by the British military establishment. He is still a colonial, still looked down upon, still denied the regular commission he craves. December 1758. George Washington resigns his commission. He is 26 years old. His military career, he believes, is over. He has learned several things in these 4 years. He has learned how to command men, how to endure hardship, how to survive battle. He has learned the wilderness, its dangers and possibilities. And he has learned to resent British arrogance, British contempt for Americans, British assumptions of superiority. These lessons will matter. Not yet, but later. For now, the warrior returns home to Mount Vernon, which is his now, Sarah having died and Anne having remarried, seeking different conquests. Land, wealth, a proper marriage, establishment as a Virginia gentleman. The sword will be put away. The surveying instruments brought out again. The ambition redirected from military glory to social status and economic success. He thinks he is done with war. He thinks the bloody years in the wilderness were a chapter now closed, memorable but complete. He cannot imagine that in less than 2 decades, he will take up arms again. Cannot imagine that the resentment he feels toward British officers will grow into something larger, more dangerous, revolutionary. But the seeds are planted in the blood-soaked mud of Fort Necessity, in the bullet-torn forest where Braddock fell, in 100 small humiliations, 1,000 casual dismissals. George Washington has learned what it means to be treated as inferior by people he does not actually believe his superiors. That knowledge will ferment, darken, eventually transform into something the British Empire will regret teaching him. For now, though, he rides toward Mount Vernon and a different future. The plantation awaits, and so does Martha Custis, January 6, 1759. George Washington marries Martha Dandridge Custis at her estate, the White House plantation on the Pamunkey River. He is 26. She is 27, a widow for just over a year. Her first husband, Daniel Parker Custis, died suddenly in 1757, leaving her one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. 18,000 acres, nearly 300 slaves, and custody of 2 young children. Jackie, age 4, and Patsy, age 2. It is not a romantic match, at least not in its origins. Washington has been courting her since spring of 1758, riding from his military duties to her plantation when he could manage it. He is attracted to her, certainly. She is small, vivacious, capable. But he is also attracted to what she represents: wealth, status, entree into the highest levels of Virginia society. Martha, for her part, needs a manager for the vast estate she has inherited, someone competent and trustworthy to handle the business affairs she cannot legally control as a woman. And she needs a father for her children. The marriage is practical. It is also, by the standards of the time and place, successful. They will remain together for 40 years until his death. She will follow him through war, endure Valley Forge, manage Mount Vernon in his absence. If their letters to each other contain no great declarations of passion, and we cannot know for certain, since Martha burned them all after his death, there is ample evidence of mutual respect, affection, partnership. It is enough, perhaps more than enough. The wedding is a grand affair. Virginia gentry fill the house. There is feasting, dancing, the kind of celebration befitting the union of a war hero and a wealthy widow. Afterward, Washington brings his new family home to Mount Vernon, the estate he inherited when Lawrence's daughter Sarah died, the property that will become synonymous with his name. Instant fatherhood. Jackie and Patsy are both young enough that Washington is the only father they will remember. He takes the role seriously, though he approaches it with the same meticulous attention to detail he brings to everything else. He orders books from London on child rearing. He keeps accounts of every penny spent on the children's clothing, education, medical care. He worries over them, especially Patsy, who from early childhood shows signs of illness, seizures that the doctors cannot explain or treat. With Jackie, the relationship is more complicated. The boy is spoiled, indulged by his mother, resistant to discipline and study. Washington tries to instill industry, responsibility, the virtues he believes make a man. Jackie would rather hunt, dance, charm the ladies. The tension between stepfather and stepson will persist throughout Jackie's short life. Washington pushing for improvement, Jackie resisting, Martha mediating between them. But with Patsy, Washington is tender, unfailingly tender. When she has seizures, fits, they call them, he holds her, comforts her, summons every doctor he can find. He buys her trinkets, indulges her small requests, shows a softness he displays nowhere else. She is fragile, vulnerable, and he loves her for it in ways he cannot quite articulate. Mount Vernon becomes his project, his canvas, the physical manifestation of his aspirations. The house, when he inherits it, is modest, a story and a half, adequate, but not grand. Washington begins expanding it immediately. He raises the roof, adds a second full story, extends the building in both directions. He imports materials, hires craftsmen, oversees every detail of construction. The architecture is elegant but not ostentatious. The taste of a man who knows he is being watched, who wants to impress without appearing to try too hard. The estate itself grows. He acquires adjacent properties, expands the farms, experiments with crops and techniques. Washington reads voraciously on agricultural science, books from England on crop rotation, soil improvement, animal husbandry. He tries new methods, plowing deeper, fertilizing with manure and river mud, rotating crops to preserve the soil. He keeps detailed records of every experiment, noting what works and what fails. Because tobacco, the traditional cash crop of Virginia, is failing. Not as a plant, it still grows. But as an economic system, it is grinding the planters into debt. The cycle is vicious. Tobacco exhausts the soil, requiring ever more land to maintain production. The plants are labor-intensive, requiring large numbers of enslaved workers. The crop must be sold to British merchants who control prices and extend credit at high interest. The planters buy luxury goods from England, furniture, clothing, books, wine, always on credit, always falling further behind. Washington watches his fellow planters spiral into insolvency, their estates mortgaged to London firms they will never satisfy. He determines to break free. By the mid-1760s, he is shifting production from tobacco to wheat. Wheat is less labor-intensive, doesn't exhaust the soil as rapidly, can be sold in multiple markets rather than just through British merchants. It is a rational decision, almost coldly calculated, but it is also radical for Virginia, where tobacco is not just a crop, but a way of life, a marker of status. The transition requires capital, which Washington doesn't have. He is land-rich and cash-poor, like most planters. The Custis fortune helps. Martha's dower portion provides income. But most of that wealth is tied up in land and slaves, not liquid assets. He borrows, juggles debts, sells land strategically. His account books are meticulous, every transaction recorded. A payment to a blacksmith, 3 shillings for nails, £10 for seed, wages for hired labor to supplement the enslaved workforce. About that workforce, by 1770, Mount Vernon is home to more than 200 enslaved people. They grow the crops, tend the animals, cook the food, wash the clothes, build the buildings, maintain the grounds. They are the foundation on which everything rests. Washington's wealth, his comfort, his ability to pursue scientific farming and political ambitions, all of it depends on their unpaid labor. He records them in his ledgers like livestock, names, ages, skills, which plantation they work. He buys and sells them when necessary, though he prefers to avoid breaking up families. He oversees their work, sometimes harshly. There are records of runaways, of punishments. But he also provides better food and clothing than many Virginia planters, and he increasingly expresses private unease about the institution. Not unease enough to free them, of course, not during his life. The contradiction is profound and irresolvable. Washington knows slavery is wrong, writes about it in abstract moral terms, but cannot imagine giving up the wealth and status it provides. So the enslaved people of Mount Vernon remain enslaved, tending the gardens he designs, building the mansion he conceives, making possible the life he cultivates. In 1758, Washington is elected to the House of Burgesses, Virginia's colonial legislature. It is his first political office, and he takes to it cautiously. He is not a natural speaker. His voice is weak, his manner stiff. But he learns to work behind the scenes, building alliances, serving on committees, mastering the procedural details that make legislation possible. He becomes friends with George Mason, with Patrick Henry, with other Virginians who are growing restive under British rule. Because the debt is not just personal, it is political. By the late 1760s, nearly every major Virginia planter owes money to British merchants. The debts are crushing, inescapable. And Britain keeps adding insult to injury. New taxes, new restrictions on colonial trade, new assertions of parliamentary authority over matters Virginians believe should be their own to decide. Washington watches, listens, begins to simmer. He is not radical by temperament. He wants order, stability, respect for law. But he is also proud, resentful of condescension, and increasingly convinced that Britain treats the colonies as subordinates rather than partners. The memory of British officers dismissing colonial troops still rankles. The mounting debt to British merchants feels like vassalage. When Parliament passes the Stamp Act in 1765, Washington is among those who protest, though quietly, respectfully, through proper legal channels. Home life continues its rhythms. The estate expands, the children grow. Patsy's seizures worsen despite every medical intervention Washington can procure. He takes her to specialists in Philadelphia, tries experimental treatments, prays. Nothing works. She has seizures several times a month, sometimes several times a week. Between attacks, she is sweet, gentle, devoted to her stepfather. During them, she convulses, froths, loses consciousness, terrifies everyone who witnesses it. Jackie, meanwhile, proves resistant to education. Washington sends him to various tutors and schools. The boy learns little, preferring social life to study. By his late teens, he falls in love with Eleanor Calvert and wants to marry. Washington urges delay. Finish your education first. Become settled. But Jackie is insistent, and Martha supports him. Washington yields, frustrated but accepting. The wedding is planned for early 1774. But Patsy will not see it. June 19th, 1773. A Saturday afternoon at Mount Vernon. Patsy Custis, 17 years old, is in the dining room with her stepfather and mother. She seems well, cheerful even. Then, without warning, she makes a small sound. Washington looks up. She is convulsing, falling. He catches her, lowers her to the floor. The seizure lasts 2 minutes. She does not recover. She dies in his arms. The grief is overwhelming. Washington, who maintains iron control in every circumstance, who faced bullets and death without flinching, is undone by the death of this fragile girl. He orders mourning rings for friends and family, inscribed with her name and dates. He settles her estate. She was enormously wealthy in her own right, having inherited part of the Custis fortune. The money will help pay off his debts, secure Mount Vernon's future. But the calculation feels obscene, a balance sheet in the face of loss. Martha retreats into deep mourning. For months, she barely leaves her room. Washington manages the plantation, handles the correspondence, makes the arrangements. But privately, he is shattered in ways he cannot express. The girl he loved, the child he protected, is gone. And all his wealth, all his influence, all his careful planning could not save her. Life continues because it must. The farms need tending. The slaves need directing. The House of Burgesses meets, debates, grows more defiant toward British authority. Washington attends, participates, his grief channeled into the minutiae of colonial politics. He is 41 years old. His military career is long past. His domestic life has been struck by tragedy. His financial situation is precarious, but improving. He is a respected member of Virginia's planter aristocracy, the society he spent his youth striving to join. By any reasonable measure, he has achieved what he wanted: status, wealth, recognition. But the world is changing around him. In Boston, radicals are dumping tea into the harbor. In London, Parliament is passing laws that colonists consider tyrannical. The debt crisis deepens. The political tensions mount. And George Washington, planter and legislator, gentleman and slave owner, stepfather and grieving parent, is being pulled towards something he does not yet fully recognize. Revolution is coming, not because anyone planned it, but because thousands of small resentments, practical grievances, and clashing principles are accumulating like powder in a magazine, waiting for a spark. Washington does not want war. He is comfortable, established, conservative by instinct. But he also remembers British officers treating him like a servant. He sees his debts to British merchants as a form of bondage. He believes in the rights of Englishmen, and increasingly believes those rights are being violated. The planter's life, the careful agriculture, the domestic routine, the political maneuvering will soon give way to something unimaginable. But not yet. For now, there is wheat to plant, accounts to balance, a stepson's wedding to attend, a daughter to mourn. The revolution will wait a little longer, though not much longer. September 5th, 1774, Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia. George Washington arrives at the First Continental Congress wearing his old militia uniform from the French and Indian War. He is the only delegate in military dress. The message is impossible to miss. This crisis may require military solutions. It is theater, carefully calculated. But what does Washington himself believe? Is he ready for revolution? Not yet. His politics have evolved slowly over a decade of grievances. The Stamp Act angered him. The intolerable acts seemed tyrannical. In July 1774, he and George Mason wrote the Fairfax Resolves, asserting colonial rights. But Washington still thinks of himself as British, still wants reconciliation. He is a conservative defending traditional liberties, not a revolutionary seeking independence. The Continental Congress drafts petitions, organizes boycotts, agrees to meet again if Britain does not respond favorably. Washington returns to Mount Vernon to wait, to prepare, to wonder what comes next. The winter passes. British policy does not change. The Continental Army begins stockpiling weapons and powder in Massachusetts. British forces in Boston, under General Thomas Gage, prepare to seize those stockpiles. April 19th, 1775. Lexington and Concord. British troops march to confiscate colonial weapons. Militia gather to stop them. Shots are fired. Who fired first will be debated forever. 8 militiamen die at Lexington Green. The British press onto Concord, destroy some supplies. then retreat toward Boston through a gauntlet of rifle fire from militia hidden behind trees and stone walls. By day's end, 73 British soldiers are dead, 200 wounded or missing. The colonial militia have suffered half that many casualties. War has begun, not as policy or declaration, but as fact, as blood spilled and bodies buried. News reaches Virginia in late April. Washington receives it at Mount Vernon. Everything has changed. The question is no longer whether to resist British policy, but how to fight a British army. The question is no longer theoretical, but immediate, practical, deadly. May 10, 1775. The Second Continental Congress convenes. Washington arrives in uniform again. New England militia have surrounded Boston, besieging the British garrison. Congress must decide. Adopt this army. Appoint a commander? John Adams sees the political necessity. A Virginian commanding New England troops would unite the colonies. And Washington, tall, dignified, sitting in his uniform, is the perfect symbol. June 14th, 1775. Adams nominates Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington leaves the room, embarrassed, while Congress debates. There is almost no opposition. He has military experience, is from Virginia, is wealthy enough that no one can accuse him of seeking personal gain. But does Washington want it? He is 43, has a wife, an estate to manage. He is past the age when most men seek military glory. And he remembers the frontier wars, remembers what leadership in combat means. Yet when summoned back, he accepts. His speech is brief, humble. He says he does not think himself equal to the command, will accept no salary. If he fails, he hopes Congress will remember he warned them. The humility is genuine, but also calculated. He accepts because duty demands it, because Virginia's honor requires it, because he cannot refuse. June 23rd, 1775. Washington leaves Philadelphia for Boston. Martha watches him go from Mount Vernon, knowing it may be years before he returns. He rides north with his aides through Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. Everywhere, people gather to see him, the new general, the hope of American resistance. He stops in New York City, reviews militia, issues orders. The weight of command settles on his shoulders like a physical thing. July 2nd, 1775. He arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and takes command of the Continental Army. What he finds appalls him. This is not an army. It is a mob. 16,000 men camped in rough shelters around Boston. No uniforms, no standard weapons, no discipline. The New England militia operate as democracies, electing their officers, debating orders, coming and going as they please. When their enlistments expire, often just weeks away, they simply leave, go home to harvest crops or tend businesses. There is no chain of command, no organization, no reliable supply system. And the men themselves, Washington can barely conceal his contempt. They are farmers, mechanics, laborers. They slouch when they should stand at attention. They argue with officers. They gamble, drink, relieve themselves wherever convenient. Officers fraternize with enlisted men, even share tents with them. It violates everything Washington understands about military hierarchy and discipline. Worse, they are New Englanders, and Washington's prejudices against New Englanders run deep. He considers them levelers, Democrats, infected with dangerous ideas about equality. They lack the proper deference to rank and station. Their officers are tradesmen and farmers, not gentlemen. The whole arrangement offends his sense of how an army should be organized. But this is what he has. This is what he must transform into a force capable of facing British regulars. The same troops who destroyed Braddock's column, who garrison fortresses around the world, who have made Britain master of half the globe. Washington begins issuing orders immediately. New regulations for camp discipline, punishment for infractions, organization into proper brigades and regiments, construction of fortifications, inventory of weapons and ammunition. He works 18-hour days, dictating letters, reviewing reports, inspecting positions. His aides scramble to keep up. The siege of Boston continues, but it is static, almost surreal. The British, under General William Howe, now that Gage has been recalled, hold the city and the harbor. The Americans surround them on land, but lack the cannon to drive them out. Both sides watch each other, occasionally exchange fire, but neither can force a decisive battle. Washington chafes at the stalemate. He wants action, a chance to prove the army, to strike a blow that will inspire the colonies and intimidate the British. His subordinates urge caution. The army is too raw, too poorly equipped. An assault on Boston would be suicidal. The troops themselves are a constant challenge. Desertions are common. Smallpox breaks out in camp. Washington, immune from his Barbados infection, orders quarantine and inoculation. Supplies run short, enlistments expire, and whole regiments simply walk away, heading home despite Washington's pleas and orders. He has to rebuild the army even while commanding it. And always, the class tensions simmer. Washington cannot understand why the New Englanders resist discipline, why they question orders, why they insist on electing officers instead of accepting appointments based on social rank. To him, it seems like chaos, a rejection of the natural order. To the New Englanders, Washington seems like an aristocrat, a would-be tyrant trying to impose Virginia's hierarchies on Massachusetts's democracies. But slowly, grudgingly, the mob begins to resemble an army. Drill becomes routine. Officers learn to enforce discipline. Supply lines stabilize. Washington's force of will, his relentless attention to detail, his absolute refusal to accept disorder, these begin to have effect. The men may not love him, may grumble about the Virginian and his rigid ways, but they start to respect him. He is fair in his punishments, shares their hardships, clearly knows what he is doing. More importantly, they see that he is committed. He could have stayed at Mount Vernon, lived in comfort, let others fight. Instead, he is here, in Cambridge, working himself to exhaustion, taking responsibility for an impossible situation. That counts for something. Winter approaches. The siege continues. Congress debates independence while trying to avoid saying the word. Washington writes letter after letter, requesting supplies, reinforcements, authority to act. He is learning politics as he learned warfare, by immersion, by necessity, by making mistakes and adapting. He is also learning what it means to command Americans rather than British regulars. These men cannot be controlled by fear alone. They need to be persuaded, inspired, led by example. They are fighting for their homes, their rights, their vision of liberty, not for pay or glory or king. It makes them difficult subordinates, but potentially formidable soldiers. The planter from Virginia is becoming something else. Not just a general, but a symbol, a focal point for American resistance. He did not seek this transformation, but having accepted it, he will see it through to whatever end awaits. Boston sits before him, British flags flying over its fortifications. Behind him, an army that is not yet truly an army, waits for spring, for supplies, for some chance to prove itself. And George Washington, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone at Mount Vernon with his farms and his family, finds himself responsible for a revolution he did not start and cannot now escape. The burden of command settles deeper. This is not the glory he imagined as a young man. This is anxiety, uncertainty, the weight of thousands of lives depending on his decisions. But he will carry it, because he said he would, because duty demands it, because there is, quite simply, no one else. March 17th, 1776. The British evacuate Boston after Washington places cannon on Dorchester Heights. The army has forced the British to abandon a major city. It is Washington's first real victory. The hope is an illusion. Boston is peripheral. The British are repositioning for something far more overwhelming. April 1776. Washington marches to New York, where the British will strike. But how do you defend an island against an enemy that controls the sea? He studies maps, builds fortifications. The fundamental problem is insoluble. July 9th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is read to troops. No more reconciliation. Only victory or total defeat. The stakes are absolute. Late July 1776. The British arrive. 400 ships fill New York Harbor. 32,000 troops. The Howe brothers command. Washington watches from Manhattan as the Armada arrives. His 19,000 men face overwhelming force. August 27th, 1776. Battle of Long Island. The British attack. Howe sends his main force around the American left flank. By afternoon, the American army is routed, driven back to Brooklyn Heights, surrounded with the East River at their backs. Washington could be captured. The war could end here. But Howe does not attack immediately. He begins a siege instead, giving Washington a night to consider his position. Night of August 29th to 30. Washington evacuates across the East River in darkness. 9,000 men, supplies, artillery. All night, boats cross and recross. The British notice nothing. By dawn, evacuation is incomplete, but the thick fog rolls in, concealing the final boats. By mid-morning, the entire army has escaped. It is miraculous, but it is also devastating defeat. 300 killed, 1,000 captured. The British have demonstrated absolute superiority. September 15th, 1776. The British land on Manhattan. Connecticut militia break and run. Washington rides to the scene, beats fleeing soldiers with his riding crop, screaming at them to stand. They ignore him. For a moment, he sits in the path of advancing British troops, seemingly paralyzed. His aides pull him away. The British occupy New York. Washington retreats north. There are small victories at Harlem Heights, but the picture is grim. November 1776. Fort Washington falls. Nearly 3,000 men surrender, the largest American loss of the war. Washington watches from across the Hudson, helpless. The army retreats across New Jersey, Newark, Brunswick, Princeton. It is December now. Enlistments expire. Entire regiments melt away. The army shrinks from 19,000 to 6,000 to fewer. Washington writes desperate letters. I think the game is pretty near up. The British pursue leisurely, confident the army will simply dissolve. Congress flees Philadelphia for Baltimore. Christmas night, 1776. The Delaware River. Washington has perhaps 2,400 combat-effective troops. Across the water, Hessians garrison Trenton. Washington plans to attack. Cross the river, darkness and winter storm. March 9 miles. Strike at dawn. Night falls. A nor'easter develops. Wind, sleet, freezing rain. The boats are loaded. The crossing takes hours longer than planned. The attack was supposed to begin before dawn. By the time the army is across, it is nearly 8 a.m. But they march anyway, through snow and sleet, toward Trenton. December 26, 1776. The attack hits from two directions. The Hessians are caught off guard. American artillery tears through the streets. In 90 minutes, nearly 1,000 Hessians surrender. American casualties are minimal, but enlistments still expire in 5 days. Washington offers $10 to any man who will stay 6 more weeks. About half agree. The rest march away. January 3rd, 1777. Princeton. Washington attacks again. The British fight back harder. Washington rides to the front, within 30 yards of British muskets. There is but a handful of the enemy, he shouts. The line holds. Princeton is taken. 2 victories have stabilized the revolution, not won it. The British still hold New York and most of New Jersey, but they have proven the war is not over. The crisis is past, at least for now. The year of disasters has ended, not in triumph, but in survival. The army still exists. Washington still commands it. That is enough. It has to be enough. September 11th, 1777. Brandywine Creek, Pennsylvania. Washington positions his army to block the British advance on Philadelphia. Howe feints at the center, marches his main force around the flank, attacks from behind. Long Island all over again. Washington's army fights hard, but is outmaneuvered, forced to retreat. October 4th, 1777. Germantown. Washington attempts a complex night attack. Fog rolls in. The columns lose contact. American units fire on each other. What should have been devastating surprise turns into chaos. The army retreats again. October 1777. The British occupy Philadelphia. Congress flees to York. Howe establishes comfortable winter quarters. By conventional logic, the war should be ending. But then news arrives from the north. October 17th, 1777. Saratoga. General Horatio Gates has forced the surrender of an entire British army under Burgoyne. Nearly 6,000 troops lay down their arms. It is the greatest American victory of the war, the triumph that will bring France into the conflict. Gates receives the glory, and inevitably, people begin comparing him to Washington. Gates has won decisively. Washington has lost Philadelphia. The whispers begin. Perhaps the wrong man is commanding. December 19th, 1777. The Continental Army marches into Valley Forge, 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Washington has chosen this position to protect Congress and block the British. The site offers defensive advantages, but almost nothing else. No buildings exist, no supplies. 12,000 men must build their own shelter before they freeze. The suffering begins immediately. Many soldiers lack shoes. Their feet leave bloody tracks in the snow. They lack blankets, proper clothing, food. The supply system has collapsed. Farmers sell to the British in Philadelphia, who pay in gold rather than to the Continental Army. Wagon drivers desert. State governments promise provisions that never arrive. Washington watches his army starve. The ration is reduced, then reduced again, then sometimes disappears. Men boil their shoes for nutrition. They catch and eat any animal they can find. Disease spreads: typhus, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. By February, more than 3,000 soldiers are unfit for duty. Hundreds die. Washington writes letter after letter pleading for supplies. He dispatches officers to scour the countryside. He threatens contractors. But the system is broken. His headquarters is a modest stone house. He dines simply, often on the same meager rations his troops receive. When supplies are short, he shares the shortage. At night, he can hear the sounds from camp: coughing, moaning, men dying in agony. And then the political knife slides between his ribs. The Conway Cabal, named for Thomas Conway, an officer who serves as Inspector General, is more rumor than conspiracy, but real enough to be dangerous. Conway has written letters criticizing Washington, praising Gates. Some members of Congress quietly agree. Gates himself seems receptive to replacing Washington. Washington learns of this through intercepted letters. He is hurt but politically astute. He cannot simply denounce the conspiracy. He must maneuver carefully. He writes to Conway, quoting back phrases from private letters, making clear he knows. Conway is shocked, frightened. Washington writes to Gates with icy formality. Gates's credibility is damaged. Congress investigates. Most delegates remain loyal to Washington, not necessarily because they think he is brilliant, but because he is indispensable. He holds the army together through force of will. The conspiracy collapses. Conway resigns. Gates is sidelined. But the victory is hollow when soldiers are dying of cold and hunger. February 1778. Martha Washington arrives. She has made this journey every winter, traveling from Mount Vernon to wherever her husband is encamped. She is 56, plump, plain, utterly uninterested in military glory. She comes because George needs her. At Valley Forge, she manages headquarters, visits the sick, writes letters to families, provides comfort. The soldiers love her for it. For Washington, she is stability, the reminder of the life he left behind. February 23rd, 1778. A Prussian officer arrives. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Congress has sent him to train the army, and Washington gives him free rein. Von Steuben speaks almost no English, curses in multiple languages, possesses genius for military training. He writes a drill manual, trains a model company personally, then spreads the system through camp. The transformation is remarkable. Troops who were ragged individuals become coordinated units. The Continental Army is becoming professional. March 1778. Spring edges into the valley. The weather warms. Supply lines improve. New recruits arrive. The army that was dying in December is recovering, hardening, transforming. May 1778. News arrives. France has signed a formal alliance with the United States. French ships, troops. Gold will support the American cause. The war has become global. The British position in Philadelphia becomes untenable. In June, General Henry Clinton evacuates the city. The army marches back toward New York. Washington pursues. June 28, 1778. Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey. Brutal heat. The Continental Army catches the British rear guard. General Charles Lee commands the American advance, but his attack stalls, then retreats in disorder. Washington arrives to find his army falling back. He confronts Lee in front of the troops, demanding to know what is happening. Lee offers excuses. Washington explodes with rage, cursing Lee with language his officers have never heard. The fury is volcanic. Washington takes personal command, steadies the line, counterattacks. The battle rages through the afternoon. The American line holds. When the British finally disengage, Washington's army holds the field. It is not decisive. The British complete their withdrawal. But it is proof of transformation. The army that broke at Kips Bay has stood and fought British regulars in open battle. The training at Valley Forge has created something new. Washington accepts Lee's resignation with cold satisfaction. The commander who stumbled through defeats has built an instrument of war that can win, but the cost, always the cost. The men who died at Valley Forge purchased this transformation with their lives. The bloody footprints, the hospital sheds, the mass graves, these are the price of an army reborn. The war is not over. It will continue for 5 more years. But something has changed. The British can no longer assume American forces will break. Washington can no longer be dismissed as an amateur. The revolution has found its army. From Valley Forge, from the frozen hell of that winter plateau, has emerged something that might, possibly, impossibly, win this war. After Monmouth, the war in the north settles into stalemate. The British hold New York. Washington's army camps in a loose arc around the city, watching, waiting. Months pass, then years. Small skirmishes, but no decisive battle. No end in sight. The war's center shifts south. May 1780. Charleston falls after a siege. 5,000 Continental soldiers surrender. August 16, 1780. Camden. Gates encounters Cornwallis. The battle is a catastrophe. Gates's militia break. His army disintegrates. Gates himself flees the battlefield. Washington watches from New York, powerless. He sends Nathanael Greene south, with what troops he can spare. The South must save itself or be lost. The waiting is corrosive. Washington is 48, has been commanding for 5 years. He lives in suspended animation. Not at peace, not at war in any decisive sense, just enduring. September 1780. Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most talented generals, has been secretly negotiating with the British. He commands West Point, the fortress controlling the Hudson. He offers to surrender it for £20,000. The plot is discovered when Major John André, the British officer coordinating with Arnold, is captured. Washington is at a meeting when the news arrives. Arnold has fled. André is in custody. The treason is complete, except for execution. The betrayal wounds Washington profoundly. Arnold was a friend, a trusted subordinate, someone he defended against critics, and Arnold sold them out for money. If Arnold could betray the cause, who else might? But André must be dealt with. The young British officer is charming, cultivated, genuinely regretful. He claims he deserves treatment as a prisoner of war rather than a spy. A military court disagrees. By the laws of war, he is a spy and must hang. Washington could show mercy, but the law is clear. Showing favoritism would undermine military justice. October 2nd, 1780. André is hanged. Washington does not attend. He has signed the order. That is enough, but he takes no pleasure in it. The hardness is necessary. Discipline requires consistency. To lead an army requires the ability to do hard things without flinching. The war grinds on. 1781 arrives. The army begins to fracture from within. January 3rd, 1781. The Pennsylvania Line mutinies. More than 1,000 soldiers march on Philadelphia, demanding back pay, proper food, discharge for expired enlistments. They remain patriots, but refuse to continue without compensation. Washington is terrified. If mutiny spreads, the army will dissolve. The mutiny is resolved through negotiation, concessions, promises. But it is a warning. January 20th, 1781. The New Jersey Line mutinies. This time, Washington acts decisively. He sends loyal troops to surround the mutineers. Return to duty or be executed. 2 ringleaders are shot. The rest submit. The contrast reveals Washington's calculated use of force. The Pennsylvania mutiny was too large to suppress. The New Jersey mutiny can be crushed to set an example. Through all this, Washington keeps writing to Congress, to state governors, to the French. He needs money, supplies, naval support. The French alliance has not produced decisive intervention. And then, summer 1781, the pieces align. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse is sailing from the Caribbean with 29 ships. Rochambeau has 5,000 French troops in Rhode Island. Cornwallis has marched to Yorktown, Virginia, establishing a base on Chesapeake Bay. If the French fleet can control the bay, if the armies can move south quickly, Cornwallis could be trapped. Washington has been planning to attack New York, but this opportunity is too good. He makes the decision with Rochambeau. They will march south secretly. August 1781. The Allied armies begin moving. Washington leaves a small force to watch New York, creating the illusion of an impending attack. The main body marches south through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland. The deception works. Clinton, in New York, does nothing to help Cornwallis. Washington pauses at Mount Vernon. his first time home in 6 years. The visit lasts 2 days. Then the march continues. September 28, 1781. The armies reach Yorktown. Cornwallis is trapped. 17,000 French and American troops on land. The French fleet controlling the sea. British ships attempt to break through at the Battle of the Chesapeake and are repulsed. The siege begins. Washington supervises construction of siege lines, placement of artillery, systematic reduction of British defenses. The French engineers are expert. The artillery is overwhelming. October 14th, 1781. 2 British redoubts must be taken. One is stormed by French troops, the other by Americans under Hamilton. Both assaults succeed. Cornwallis tries to evacuate across the York River, but a storm scatters his boats. On October 17th, a British drummer appears on the parapet, beating the signal for parley. October 19th, 1781. The surrender. The British Army marches out, nearly 8,000 men laying down their arms. Cornwallis claims illness, sends his deputy. Washington, with matching formality, has his deputy receive the surrender. The British bands play "The World Turned Upside Down." The impossible has happened. Colonial rebels have defeated a British army with French help. The war is not officially over, but everyone knows it is finished. Washington maintains perfect military correctness. No gloating. The British are permitted to march out with honors. Officers keep their swords. Washington issues orders against abuse or mockery. But privately, the relief must be overwhelming. After 6 years of defeats and narrow escapes, of watching his army suffer, he has won the decisive victory. Not through his battlefield genius, he acknowledges French help made it possible, but through endurance, through refusing to quit, through holding the army together until victory was possible. The war does not end at Yorktown. It drags on for 2 more years of negotiations. Washington keeps the Continental Army in existence near Newburgh, waiting for official peace. The waiting breeds new dangers. The army is owed years of back pay. Congress has no money. Whispers circulate. Perhaps the army should march on Philadelphia, force Congress to pay. The conspiracy is vague but dangerous. March 15th, 1783. Washington calls a meeting of officers at Newburgh. He must diffuse the conspiracy without alienating the men who served under him. He speaks with dignity, acknowledging their grievances, appealing to patriotism. The words are elegant but expected. The officers listen, unmoved. Then Washington reaches for a letter, begins to read, stumbles. He pauses, pulls spectacles from his pocket. "Gentlemen," he says, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey, but almost blind in the service of my country." The effect is electric. The officers see their commander's age, his sacrifice, the physical toll. Many weep. The conspiracy collapses. It is theater, but also truth. Washington has grown grey in their service. He has never used the army to grasp power, has always submitted to civilian authority. The officers vote to reject the conspiracy. The crisis passes. The Republic is saved by one man's moral authority, earned through 8 years of shared suffering. September 3rd, 1783. The Treaty of Paris is signed. Britain recognizes American independence. The war is officially over. November 1783. The British evacuate New York, the last city they hold. Washington enters the city he lost 7 years ago, now returned as victor. He says goodbye to his officers at Fraunces Tavern, embracing them, weeping openly. Then he travels to Annapolis, where Congress is meeting. December 23rd, 1783. Washington appears before Congress to resign his commission. The circular room is packed. Congressmen, foreign dignitaries, citizens. Washington stands, unfolds his prepared remarks. His hands tremble. His voice is weak with emotion. He reviews his service, thanks his officers, commends the cause to Providence. Then he delivers the crucial sentence. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action. He is giving up command, voluntarily, without conditions or demands. The most powerful military leader in America is laying down his sword and returning to private life, asking nothing in return except to go home. The act is almost unprecedented. Victorious generals become kings, emperors, dictators. They seize power or are given it by grateful nations. But Washington is walking away from everything military victory could provide. He is choosing Mount Vernon over a throne, private life over public glory, the role of citizen over the role of ruler. King George III, when told that Washington intends to resign and retire to his farm, reportedly says, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. He does it. On December 24, 1783, George Washington rides toward Mount Vernon, toward Martha, toward the life he left 8.5 years ago. The war is over. The command is relinquished. The impossible has been accomplished, and he is going home. December 23, 1783. Annapolis. George Washington stands before Congress to resign his commission. He has rehearsed the moment, but when he begins to speak, emotion overwhelms preparation. His hands tremble. His voice breaks. Observers note tears in his eyes. This is not performance. This is real. For 8.5 years, he has carried the weight of command. Now he is laying that burden down. He is 51. He has missed the prime years of his life fighting a war he never wanted. And now it is finished. He has kept his promise to serve until the war was won, then to step aside. No conditions, no demands, just service rendered, duty fulfilled. He finishes, hands the commission to Congress, bows and leaves. Outside, he mounts his horse and rides south toward Virginia, toward home. Christmas Eve, 1783. Washington arrives at Mount Vernon. Martha is waiting. The house is familiar, but strange. He has been gone so long. The war has aged him, grayed his hair, left him partially deaf. His teeth are failing. He writes to friends, I am become a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac, and under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree. The biblical allusion is deliberate. He is Cincinnatus returning to his plow. He throws himself into Mount Vernon. The plantation needs rebuilding. He rides his properties, inspects everything, plans improvements. The Potomac Navigation Project consumes him, a vision of canals linking the Atlantic coast with the Ohio River. He buys more western land, manages the Custis estates for Jackie's children. He is building the peaceful life he has always wanted. But the world will not leave him alone. The nation he helped create is failing. The Articles of Confederation cannot manage peacetime. States act as independent countries. Economic chaos spreads. Foreign powers view the new nation with contempt. August 1786. Shays' Rebellion. Farmers in Massachusetts rise in armed insurrection against debt and taxes. The event terrifies the property classes. Washington receives letters from all sides. Madison, Hamilton, Knox, all arguing for stronger national government. They want Washington's involvement. A convention is being planned for Philadelphia in May 1787. It will fail without Washington's presence. Washington resists. He has promised to retire. If he returns now, will people think he lied? And what if the convention fails? Better to stay at Mount Vernon, preserve his standing. But the letters keep coming. The crisis deepens. Washington cannot ignore the possibility that the cause he fought for might collapse. May 1787. Washington travels to Philadelphia. 55 delegates from 12 states gather to redesign American government. Washington is elected president of the convention unanimously. For 4 months, he says almost nothing. He presides, maintains order, votes occasionally, but participates in no debates. Madison and others do the intellectual work. But Washington's presence is crucial. When disputes grow heated, when delegates threaten to walk out, they look to the presiding officer and remember who he is. If he thinks this is legitimate, that counts for something. His silence carries more weight than others' speeches. The debates are contentious. Large states versus small. North versus South. Slavery underlies everything. Southern states will not join any union that threatens their human property. Washington owns enslaved people and says nothing as the debates enshrine slavery's protection. September 17, 1787. The Constitution is complete. 39 delegates sign. Washington signs first. Now comes the harder part, convincing states to ratify it. Opponents argue it creates tyranny, that the presidency is kingship under another name. Washington writes letters supporting ratification, but carefully. He knows what everyone knows. He is the implicit promise that makes the Constitution acceptable. The presidency has been designed with him in mind. People will accept a strong executive because they trust Washington to wield that power responsibly. And everyone assumes he will be the first president. The assumption underlies all the ratification debates. Without that assumption, the Constitution might fail. The weight of this knowledge is crushing. Washington wanted retirement, but he is being offered again a duty he cannot refuse. June 21st, 1788. New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify. The Constitution is adopted, and everyone is looking to Mount Vernon. He knows what he must do. The Republic needs him one more time, not to lead armies, but to lead the nation, to show that Republican government can work. The cost of duty, again. He is 56. His health is declining. He wants nothing more than to finish his days at Mount Vernon. But what choice does he have? The cause is larger than personal comfort. The myth of Cincinnatus is powerful. But the reality is more complicated. Cincinnatus keeps being called back. The farm keeps receding because the Republic is fragile, always requiring one more sacrifice. Washington will serve. He knows this now. The presidency awaits, and that person will be him. Because when duty calls, George Washington has never learned to say no. Mount Vernon in winter twilight. The Potomac flows past. Inside, Washington sits with his correspondents. Martha sits nearby. The moment is peaceful, domestic, but temporary. It is always temporary, because history is not finished with George Washington. April 16, 1789. George Washington leaves Mount Vernon for New York. The journey becomes a week-long pageant. Banquets, parades, girls in white dresses throwing flowers. At Trenton, women and children sing an ode composed for the occasion. The adulation both gratifies and unsettles him. He writes in his diary that his feelings are not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. He is 57 years old, deaf in one ear, his teeth mostly gone and replaced by painful dentures. He is traveling to invent a presidency that does not yet exist. April 30th, 1789, Federal Hall, New York. The inauguration. Washington stands on the balcony in a suit of brown broadcloth, American-made rather than imported, a deliberate message about domestic industry. Before him, crowds pack Wall Street and the surrounding area. The oath of office is brief, 35 words specified by the Constitution. Washington's hands tremble as he places them on the Bible. His voice is so low that observers struggle to hear. At the end, he adds 4 words, not in the Constitution. So help me God. Whether this becomes tradition or not is unclear. Accounts differ, but it feels right to him, anchoring the secular office in religious solemnity. He delivers his inaugural address inside the Senate chamber. Again, his voice is weak, barely audible. His hands shake, holding the pages. He is visibly nervous. This man who faced British armies without flinching. But commanding troops is familiar territory. This, standing as the first elected leader of a republic, setting precedents that will define American government. This is uncharted. Everything is precedent. The Constitution outlines the presidency in broad strokes, leaving almost everything to be determined by whoever first holds the office. How should people address the president? Vice President Adams proposes, His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. The House of Representatives objects, too monarchical. They settle on simply Mr. President. Washington is relieved. He wants dignity without royalty, respect without civility. How formal should the presidency be? Washington holds weekly levees, formal receptions where citizens can meet him. He stands stiffly, never shakes hands, bows to visitors who bow to him. Some criticize this as too aristocratic, but Washington believes the presidency requires formality to command respect. Too much accessibility, and the office becomes common. Too much distance, and it becomes monarchy. He seeks the middle ground, inventing Republican ceremony as he goes. He assembles his cabinet, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. He believes he can balance their views, forge unified policy. Almost immediately, Hamilton and Jefferson split into opposing camps. Hamilton wants strong central government, a national bank, federal assumption of state debts. Jefferson wants limited federal power, an agrarian republic, strict constitutional interpretation. Washington tries to mediate, but they are irreconcilable. Cabinet meetings become battlegrounds. Partisan newspapers attack each other. The divide that Washington's farewell address will later warn against is being created in his own administration. July 1790. The Residence Act passes Congress, a compromise brokered by Jefferson and Hamilton over dinner. The federal government will assume state debts, Hamilton's priority, in exchange for moving the capital from New York to a new city on the Potomac River, Jefferson's concession to Southern interests. The site will be chosen by Washington himself. He selects a location near Mount Vernon. Of course he does. The capital will be built on the river he spent years trying to make navigable, surrounded by land he knows intimately. The new city will not be ready for a decade. Meanwhile, the government moves to Philadelphia, which will serve as temporary capital. Washington rents the house of Robert Morris on High Street. It is grand but inadequate. The President of the United States living in borrowed quarters, still inventing the role as he goes. 1791. Washington's Southern tour tests, whether national unity extends beyond the North. Crowds celebrate him everywhere, but divisions are obvious. The weight of slavery bears down on everything. Washington owns more than 300 enslaved people. The presidential household in Philadelphia includes 9 enslaved workers. Pennsylvania law provides that enslaved people become free after 6 months of residence. Washington circumvents this by rotating his workers back to Virginia before the deadline. Among them is Ona Judge, who serves Martha Washington. Born at Mount Vernon, she learned to read despite prohibitions. She sees the president celebrated as the father of liberty while signing documents that keep her enslaved. She serves at dinners where guests toast Republican virtue while enslaved people pour the wine. The contradiction exists in the same room, unresolved. 1792. Washington intends to retire after 1 term. He asks James Madison to draft a farewell address, but everyone pleads with him to continue. Jefferson and Hamilton, who agree on nothing else, both insist Washington must serve another term. The nation is still fragile. Only Washington commands sufficient trust. Washington yields again. He is unanimously re-elected. Another 4 years of public service, of partisan attacks, of trying to balance irreconcilable visions. The second term will be harder. The partisan divisions will deepen. And through it all, Washington will try to maintain the dignity of the office, to set precedents that will last. But the weight grows heavier. He counts the days until he can return to Mount Vernon. The presidency he is inventing will outlast him by centuries. The precedents he sets, voluntary term limits, civilian control of military, cabinet governance, will define American government. But the personal cost is immense. Every day in office is a day away from the life he wanted. And the enslaved people serve the meals, clean the rooms, press the clothes. Washington knows this contradiction. But knowledge is not action. He will free them only in his will, only when it costs him nothing. It is not enough. The first presidency is an invention, an improvisation. Washington succeeds in establishing the office, in showing that Republican government can work. But the cost, personal, moral, political, is higher than anyone watching the celebrations can imagine. July 14th, 1789. A mob storms the Bastille in Paris. The French Revolution begins. In America, the news is greeted with celebrations. The French are following the American example. But the revolution radicalizes, consumes itself. King Louis XVI is guillotined in 1793. Then the nobles, the moderates, anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary fervor. The streets of Paris run with blood. Americans divide. Some defend the French Revolution despite its excesses. Others see only chaos, mob rule. The divide over France becomes another front in the partisan war consuming Washington's administration. April 1793. Citizen Genet arrives in Charleston as French minister to the United States. Edmund Charles Genet is young, enthusiastic, convinced that America owes France support in its war against Britain. He doesn't sail to Philadelphia to present credentials. Instead, he travels overland through the South, holding rallies, giving speeches, commissioning American ships as privateers to attack British vessels. By the time he reaches Philadelphia in May, he has already compromised American neutrality. Washington is furious. France may be an ally, may have helped win American independence, but America is too weak to enter a European war. The United States has no navy worth mentioning, a tiny army, an economy dependent on trade with Britain. Entering the war on France's side would be suicide. April 22nd, 1793. Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation. America will remain neutral in the European conflict, will trade with all sides, will support none. It is the only rational policy, the only way to preserve the fragile nation. Both factions attack him. Jefferson and his supporters see neutrality as betrayal of France, abandonment of Republican principles. They organize democratic Republican societies to oppose administration policy, hold rallies, publish newspapers denouncing Washington's cowardice. Hamilton and his supporters attack neutrality as insufficiently pro-British, want formal alliance with London against revolutionary France. Washington finds himself attacked from both sides for the same policy, vilified as either a monarchist or a Jacobin, depending on who is writing the editorial. The democratic Republican societies particularly enrage him. He sees them as seditious, French-inspired organizations trying to manipulate American politics, to undermine legitimate government through mob agitation. When the societies criticize administration policy, Washington takes it personally. These are not loyal opposition, but enemies of order, demagogues inflaming the ignorant against their betters. His response reveals his fundamentally conservative instincts. He believes in hierarchy, in deference to authority, in the danger of mass politics. The societies represent everything he fears about democracy, unrestrained by Republican virtue. Summer 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion. farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay the federal excise tax on whiskey. They, tar and feather tax collectors, threatened to march on Pittsburgh. Washington sees insurrection. He calls up 13,000 militia, the largest force assembled since the Revolution. September 1794. Washington leads the army west. He is 62 years old, has not worn a uniform in 11 years. But he rides at the head of the militia, the president in military dress, personally commanding the suppression of domestic rebellion. The rebellion collapses without a fight. A few ringleaders are arrested, tried, convicted. Washington pardons them, having made his point. The federal government can and will enforce its laws. But the episode deepens partisan divisions. 1795. The Jay Treaty. Chief Justice John Jay has negotiated a treaty with Britain resolving outstanding disputes from the Revolution. The British agree to evacuate frontier forts they still occupy in violation of the peace treaty. They grant limited American trading rights in the West Indies. In exchange, America agrees to pay pre-revolutionary debts to British merchants and accepts Britain's naval restrictions on neutral trade with France. To Washington, the treaty is pragmatic, not ideal, but the best achievable given America's weakness. To Jefferson's faction, it is betrayal. The treaty favors Britain over France, abandons Republican principles for commercial advantage, submits to British demands rather than defending American sovereignty. When the treaty becomes public, the reaction is volcanic. Protesters burn Jay in effigy across the country. They burn Washington too, the president himself, called traitor, British puppet, senile fool. Crowds stone Alexander Hamilton when he tries to defend the treaty. The House debates refusing appropriations to implement it. Newspapers that supported Washington for years turn against him with vicious personal attacks. Washington is stunned. He expected criticism. He is not naive about politics. But this is different. Personal, vitriolic, questioning his motives and his patriotism. After everything he has sacrificed, after giving his life to the country, they call him usurper, monarchist, traitor. The ingratitude wounds him deeply. He has grown old in their service, has postponed retirement repeatedly, has endured 8 years of presidential burdens, and this is his reward, to be burned in effigy, to have his loyalty questioned, to be treated as an enemy of liberty. He signs the treaty anyway, because it is the right policy, because America needs peace with Britain, because he will not be deterred by mob violence or partisan rage. But the cost is immense. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, the foundation of his political authority, is damaged, perhaps permanently. The unity he represents is revealed as illusion. The non-partisan leader is forced to choose sides, becomes the leader of Hamilton's faction, whether he wants to be or not. His private letters from this period reveal exhaustion, bitterness, hurt. He writes to friends that he is counting the days until retirement, that nothing could induce him to serve another term. He has had enough of partisan warfare, of being attacked from all sides, of watching his administration create the very factionalism he despises. September 19th, 1796. Washington publishes his farewell address in a Philadelphia newspaper. He will not seek a third term. This decision is final, irrevocable. The address is partly a justification of his policies, partly a warning to future generations. The warning focuses on partisanship. He begs Americans to avoid the baneful effects of the spirit of party. He warns against geographic factionalism, North versus South, East versus West. He cautions against permanent foreign alliances that might drag America into European wars. He urges national unity, constitutional governance, moderation in all things. The irony is profound. Washington's own administration created the two-party system. The split between Hamilton and Jefferson, which Washington could not prevent or heal, gave birth to Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The partisan warfare Washington condemns is the fruit of his presidency, not some external corruption. His warning against parties comes too late. They already exist, are already entrenched, will define American politics forever after. But Washington cannot see this irony, or will not admit it. He sees partisan division as something that happened to his administration, not something his administration created. He blames the Democratic-Republican societies, French intrigue, demagogues inflaming the masses. He does not see his own role, his inability to reconcile Hamilton and Jefferson, his increasingly partisan alignment with Federalist policies, his attacks on critics as seditious rather than loyal opposition. The farewell address is Washington's final gift to the nation, practical wisdom earned through bitter experience. But it is also his admission of failure. He could not prevent factionalism. He could not maintain unity. He could not rise above partisan conflict to embody universal principles. The father of his country leaves office exhausted, disillusioned, wounded by ingratitude, glad to escape. December 1796. John Adams is elected president. The succession is peaceful. The first time power transfers from one elected leader to another without violence. This is Washington's real achievement. He has shown that republics can change leaders without collapsing. March 4th, 1797. Adams's inauguration. Washington attends as a private citizen, wearing black. Observers note that Adams seems nervous, while Washington appears radiantly happy. His burden is lifting. Washington leaves Philadelphia the next day, riding south. No celebrations this time, no crowds, just a man going home. March 15th, 1797. Washington arrives at Mount Vernon. He is 65 years old. His presidency is finished. His public life is over, truly over this time. He writes to a friend, "I am become a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac, and under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree." Finally, he will have it. Finally, he can rest. But he has only 2 years, 9 months, and 19 days left. For now, though, riding up the lane with the Potomac flowing past, George Washington allows himself to believe that his trials are over, that he can finally, just be left alone. Mount Vernon, spring 1997. Washington is home. Finally, permanently, home. He rises before dawn and rides out to inspect his farms. 5 farms across 8,000 acres, worked by more than 300 enslaved people. He carries a notebook, recording everything. Which fields need ploughing, which slaves are sick, where fences need repair. He experiments constantly, new crop rotations, different fertilizers, imported seeds. His fields are laboratories. Some experiments fail. The soil is exhausted from tobacco. But he persists. The visitors never stop. Mount Vernon has become a pilgrimage site. Washington writes that they have no privacy, that Mount Vernon has become a well-resorted tavern. He writes letters, hundreds of them, to old comrades, to political allies, to agricultural societies. He declines repeated requests to enter politics again, to run for governor, to mediate disputes. He is finished with public life, but he cannot escape it entirely. People still seek his blessing, his endorsement, his involvement. His name carries weight, and everyone wants to use it. 1798. The quasi-war with France. The relationship with France, damaged by Jay's Treaty and Washington's neutrality policy, has collapsed into undeclared naval warfare. French privateers seize American merchant ships. American ships fight back. It is war in all but name. President Adams asks Congress to expand the army, to prepare for possible French invasion. And Adams asks Washington to command again, to accept appointment as Lieutenant General, to organize and lead the Provisional Army if war comes. Washington is 66 years old, retired, done with military service. But Adams argues that only Washington's name can rally the nation, can give the army credibility. Washington accepts. Not eagerly. He negotiates conditions, insists on choosing his own subordinates, makes clear he will not actually take the field unless invasion is imminent. But he accepts the commission, the uniform, the burden. Always the burden. Always the duty he cannot refuse. He spends months corresponding about army organization, officer appointments, strategic planning. The war never fully materializes. Diplomacy eventually resolves the crisis. But for 2 years, Washington is technically commander of the army again, unable even in retirement to escape what his life has always been. Through everything, the enslaved workers of Mount Vernon labor. Washington manages them with meticulous attention, detailed records. He knows their names, their skills, their families, and he knows it is wrong. He wrote as early as the 1780s that he wished to see slavery abolished. He told visitors he would never buy another enslaved person. He drafted plans for gradual emancipation, but he never implemented any of it during his lifetime. Mount Vernon could not function without enslaved labor. His wealth would collapse. And Martha's dower slaves, nearly half the total, were Custis property he could not legally free, so he did nothing. Year after year, he managed, directed, sold enslaved people while privately believing the system was morally indefensible. His will, drafted in July 1799, finally confronted the contradiction. He ordered that all enslaved people he owned personally, 123 people, should be freed after Martha's death. But this created a horrifying situation. Martha would live among people who would become free the moment she died, and it would not free Martha's dower slaves, separating families. The daily routine continues. Washington rises early, rides for hours inspecting his farms. He eats breakfast, manages correspondence, receives visitors, eats dinner, retires early. He is aging visibly now. His teeth are almost entirely gone. He wears dentures made from ivory and lead and springs, painful and ill-fitting. His hearing is failing. He moves more slowly, tires more easily, but his mind remains sharp, his will unbending. He can no longer sit a horse for 10 hours as he once did, can no longer work through the night on military dispatches, but he refuses to acknowledge limitations. He is George Washington, has always been strong, cannot admit weakness. So he rides in all weather, inspects in rain and snow, pushes himself as if he were still 30. December 12th, 1799. Thursday. Washington rises at dawn despite threatening weather. Snow is falling, turning to freezing rain. He rides out anyway, inspecting the farms for 5 hours. His overseer notes later that snow was hanging from Washington's hair and clothes when he finally returned. He is soaked, chilled, exhausted, but he does not change clothes before dinner, would not want to keep guests waiting. He eats in his wet garments, seemingly unbothered. December 13th, 1799. Friday. Washington wakes with a sore throat. He goes out briefly to mark some trees for cutting, his voice already hoarse. By afternoon, the throat is worse. By evening, he can barely speak. Martha wants to send for a doctor. Washington refuses. It's just a cold. Will pass on its own. They go to bed. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, Martha wakes to find Washington struggling to breathe. December 14th, 1799. The final day unfolds as described in the opening chapter. The doctors arrive. The bleeding begins. The suffering intensifies. The terrible treatments accomplish nothing. By late afternoon, Washington knows he is dying. He has always faced death with stoicism, has survived smallpox and battlefield bullets, dysentery, and the physical collapse at Valley Forge. But this is different. This is defeat, final and absolute. The doctors cluster around, helpless. Martha sits watching, her face composed, hiding whatever grief she feels. The enslaved servants wait at the margins, witnesses to their master's death, uncertain what it means for their futures. Christopher, Tobias Lear, the others, all watching the great man reduced to suffering flesh, struggling for breath, drowning in his own inflamed tissue. Around 10 o'clock, Washington feels his own pulse, the physician monitoring his own decline. He looks at the doctors, whispers his final coherent words. I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead. He fears being buried alive, wants time to ensure death is certain. Even facing death, he plans, specifies, controls what he can control. His hand in Martha's grows still. His breathing becomes labored, then shallow, then stops. Dr. Craik leans close, finds no pulse. He is gone. The room holds its silence. Then activity, preparing the body, sending word, beginning the machinery of mourning. But in that moment, there is only absence. What remains is memory, myth, and the questions he could not answer. How do we measure a life lived in service to ideals it could not fully embody? Washington's body will lie in state. The nation will mourn. Eulogies will transform the man into monument. But here in this room, there is only a body growing cold, and the people left to make sense of what his life meant. The enslaved people will discover their freedom depends on Martha Washington's death. Martha will free Washington's enslaved workers in January 1801, unable to live with people waiting for her to die. The Custis slaves will remain enslaved, families separated. The agricultural experiments will continue. The Potomac Navigation Project will proceed. Mount Vernon will become a museum. The presidency he invented will endure, but the contradictions remain unresolved. The man who could have been king but chose to be citizen also chose to keep human beings in bondage. The man who gave his life to public service also compromised the principles he served. These are the last years. Retirement briefly enjoyed, old age after glory, unfinished business that death leaves incomplete. Washington dies as he lived, with dignity, with stoicism, but also with contradictions he could not reconcile, with compromises he could not undo. The storm outside continues. Inside Mount Vernon, the first president of the United States is dead, and America must decide what to do with his complicated, contradictory, indispensable legacy. The news spreads slowly, then faster. A rider leaves Mount Vernon on December 15th. By December 18th, Philadelphia knows. By week's end, the nation knows. George Washington is dead. The grief is overwhelming. People who never met him weep openly. Businesses close. Churches hold memorial services. Men wear black armbands. In Philadelphia, Congress suspends business. Funeral processions march through streets. Mock funerals are held. Coffins draped in black. Eulogies delivered since the body remains at Mount Vernon. Henry Lee delivers the most famous tribute. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The phrase becomes gospel. In France, Napoleon orders 10 days of mourning. British naval vessels lower their colors. King George III's reported statement is repeated. If Washington resigns and returns to farming, he will be the greatest man in the world. But the myth-making begins immediately. Parson Mason Locke Weems writes a biography designed for moral instruction. Weems invents stories. Young George chopping down a cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie. Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac. Washington praying in the snow at Valley Forge. None of it happened. All of it becomes American memory. Weems Washington is not a man, but a collection of virtues. Honest, pious, strong, wise. The real Washington, who gambled, who swore, who owned enslaved people, disappears behind the marble facade. The memory is useful, which is why it persists. America needs Washington to be perfect because the experiment needs validation. The myth serves national purposes that human truth cannot. Different groups claim Washington for competing visions. Federalists cite him as their champion. Democratic Republicans claim him too. Unionists in the 1860s invoke Washington. Secessionists invoke Washington, the revolutionary. Everyone wants him on their side. The monuments rise. The Washington Monument, a pure obelisk, 555 feet tall, completed in 1884. The Marble Memorial, dedicated in 1922, shows Washington enthroned like Zeus, 19 feet tall, bearing no trace of the pox scars from Barbados. Mount Vernon becomes a shrine, purchased in 1858, preserved as Washington lived, or as people imagine he lived. Millions visit, seeking connection to the founder. But what of the enslaved people freed by his will? The 123 people Washington owned were freed on January 1st, 1801. They received freedom, but little else. Some prospered. Some remained at Mount Vernon as paid workers. Some disappeared into obscurity. The Custis slaves, 153 people, remained enslaved, divided among heirs when Martha died in 1802. Families separated. Owner Judge lived until 1848. She was interviewed in old age, told her story of service and flight. She died in poverty, but free. These stories complicate the myth. A nation worshipping Washington, the liberator, must confront Washington, the enslaver. Each generation reimagines Washington. The 19th century emphasized his spotless character. The early 20th century celebrated his executive leadership. The 1960s and 70s began questioning, examining the slavery. Modern scholarship strives for fuller understanding, not debunking the myth, but complicating it to approach truth. We know now that Washington was brilliant, but not a military genius. He lost more battles than he won. We know he had a volcanic temper, kept it mostly controlled. We know he was a slaveholder who never freed his enslaved workers during his lifetime. His actual legacy is profound. He established precedents, the two-term tradition, the cabinet system, civilian control of military, most importantly, the peaceful transfer of power. Washington voluntarily resigned in 1783, voluntarily left the presidency in 1797. Power passed from one elected leader to another without violence. The precedent has held for more than 2 centuries. This is his greatest gift, the demonstration that power can be temporary, that leaders can be citizens, that republics can function without kings. The cherry tree is fiction. The prayer at Valley Forge is invention. But the man who resigned his command, he was real. The precedents he set are real. We can honor the real man without requiring perfection. We can acknowledge his enslavement of human beings while recognizing his contribution to human liberty. This is harder than myth, but it is truer. George Washington was not the greatest man in the world. He was a man in the world, capable of both nobility and moral failure. He commanded armies, established governments, owned human beings, freed them only in death. He was human, which makes what he accomplished more remarkable, not less. The immortal Washington of myth will persist, but alongside the myth, we can hold the man, complicated, flawed, real. Both are part of the legacy, the symbol that inspired a nation and the human being who could not fully live up to that symbol. This is legacy, what we remember, what we forget, what we choose to honor. Washington's legacy is all of it, the precedents and the contradictions, the marble monument and the bleeding man. What happens when power is voluntary? This is the question George Washington answered, twice, definitively, not through words or theories, but through action, through the simple, radical act of walking away. December 23rd, 1783, Annapolis. a general who commanded the only army on the continent, who could have marched on Congress and made himself dictator, who had officers begging him to seize control. The general handed his commission to a group of politicians and went home. The army he could have used to take power was disbanded. The authority he could have claimed was surrendered. The moment passed. March 4th, 1797. Philadelphia. A president who had been unanimously elected, who could have remained in office for life, who was still revered despite the partisan attacks. The president attended his successor's inauguration as a private citizen and then rode home to Virginia. The power he held voluntarily, he voluntarily relinquished. The office that had been designed with him in mind passed to someone else. The precedent was set. 2 resignations, 2 acts of renunciation, 2 moments when the entire pattern of human history could have continued. The general becomes dictator, the president becomes king, and didn't. The model was Roman. Cincinnatus, the citizen soldier who saved the republic and returned to his farm. Washington knew the story, consciously embraced the parallel. But this wasn't Rome. Rome's republic eventually failed, gave way to emperors, proved that voluntary power was temporary and fragile. America's republic was new, untested, could fail just as easily. Washington's resignations were not copying a proven model, but attempting something uncertain, something that might not work. King George III, when told that Washington intended to resign his military commission and return to farming, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He did it. And then, 14 years later, he did it again. The contrast with other revolutions is stark and instructive. France's revolution, which began with such hope, devoured its own children and ended with Napoleon crowning himself emperor. The Latin American revolutions of the early 19th century produced liberators who became dictators. Simón Bolívar died disillusioned. His dream of united republics fractured into military strongmen competing for power. The 20th century saw revolution after revolution follow the same pattern. The guerrilla leader becomes the autocrat. The freedom fighter becomes the tyrant. Liberation becomes a new form of bondage. How many times has this happened? How many revolutionary leaders, having won power through force, then refused to relinquish it? Castro in Cuba, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, countless others who fought for freedom and then clutched power until death or overthrow finally ended their rule. The pattern is so common it seems inevitable, so established it appears to be human nature. Those who gain power keep it. But Washington showed it doesn't have to be that way. You can walk away. You can serve and then stop serving. You can hold power temporarily, use it to establish something larger than yourself, and then let it go. This is his permanent example, relevant across centuries and continents, not his military tactics or his agricultural experiments or his political positions. Those are specific to his time. But the act of voluntary resignation transcends context. It speaks to anyone, anywhere, who must decide whether to hold power or release it, whether to serve or to rule. Was Washington perfect? No. We must not look away from his flaws to preserve the myth. He owned enslaved people, more than 300 human beings whose labor generated his wealth and status. He freed them only in death, only when it cost him nothing. He participated in the displacement of Native Americans, signed treaties that were violated, oversaw a westward expansion built on indigenous dispossession. He could be harsh, cold, unforgiving. He had soldiers flogged for desertion, executed mutineers, watched men die from his decisions with whatever private anguish he felt carefully hidden. He was vain about his appearance, sensitive to criticism, capable of volcanic rage barely controlled. He made military mistakes that cost lives, political decisions that deepened divisions, moral compromises that contradicted his stated ideals. He was, in other words, a man of his time and class, limited by assumptions he never questioned, participant in systems of oppression he never fully challenged. But the essential act, the choice to limit power, to step down when continuing was possible, that was genuine, that was transformative, that changed what was imaginable for Republican government. The Marble Man and the Bleeding Man, both were real. The monument that towers over the National Mall represents something true about Washington's significance. The flawed human being who owned slaves and died in agony represents something true about Washington's limitations. American memory can hold both. American history requires both. His legacy is not perfection. Perfection is impossible, inhuman, ultimately unhelpful as a model. His legacy is the demonstration that imperfect people can still establish just institutions, that flawed leaders can still set useful precedents, that someone shaped by an unjust society can still contribute to something more just. The power to limit power, the strength to say no to what you want, the discipline to serve temporarily when permanence is possible. This is what Washington showed was achievable. Not easy. Every account suggests the resignations cost him genuine anguish. Not natural. Ambition and the hunger for recognition were lifelong companions. But possible because he did it, because the evidence is historical fact rather than moral aspiration. Mount Vernon at twilight. The Potomac flows past, gray-green and eternal, as it flowed when Washington watched it, as it flowed before humans lived on these shores, as it will flow when the monuments crumble and the Republic is gone. The mansion sits above the river, preserved now, a museum rather than a working plantation. Visitors walk the grounds, stand where Washington stood, try to imagine the man who lived here. The enslaved quarters have been reconstructed, finally, after decades of being erased from the tour. The interpreters explain the contradiction now. How Washington owned people while fighting for liberty. How Mount Vernon's beauty depended on bondage. How the father of his country failed the test of universal freedom. The story is more honest now, more complete, more true. Somewhere in Philadelphia, the Constitution endures, the document Washington helped create, signed, and submitted to. It governs still, amended and reinterpreted, but fundamentally intact. It endures not because it was perfect. The Constitution of 1787 protected slavery, disenfranchised women, limited democracy in ways its framers thought necessary. It required amendments to approach its own promises of liberty and equality. But it endures because Washington showed it could work. Because he demonstrated that presidents serve terms and then leave. Because he proved that power could be constitutional rather than personal, temporary rather than permanent, derived from consent rather than force. The document works because the first person to hold power under it chose to show that power could be limited by stepping down when he could have held on, by being mortal when he could have claimed to be more, by choosing the role of citizen over the role of ruler twice when the easier choice was available. This is the greatest power, the power to say no to power itself, not the power to command armies. Washington did that, but so have countless generals who used military might to seize control, not the power to inspire followers. Washington did that, but so have demagogues who led nations into tyranny. The unique power, the transformative power, the power that changed history, the ability to walk away from absolute authority because Republican principles matter more than personal aggrandizement. Every peaceful transfer of power in American history traces back to Washington's example. Every president who leaves office when their term expires, who accepts electoral defeat without military resistance, who submits to constitutional limits, they are following the precedent Washington established. The norm is so strong now we take it for granted. But norms begin somewhere, with someone choosing to honor a principle when violating it would be easier. The question Washington answered was not theoretical. It was immediate, practical, consequential. Will you use your power to keep power? Will you transform victory into authority, authority into permanence, permanence into dynasty? Or will you serve and then stop, lead and then follow, command and then obey? He answered, I will stop. I will step down. I will go home. And in answering, he created the possibility that republics could survive their founding generation, that constitutional government could outlast its framers, that nations could be larger than the leaders who established them. The winter storm that howled around Mount Vernon the night Washington died has long since passed. The doctors who bled him are forgotten, except as footnotes. The enslaved people who watched him die left few records. Their descendants carry forward memories that oral history preserved, but official accounts erased. Martha burned the letters, destroying the private marriage to protect the public monument. What remains is the essential truth. A man held power twice when keeping it was possible, and chose to let it go. Chose republic over empire, chose limitation over ambition, chose to be Cincinnatus for real, not as performance, but as principle embodied in action. This is what we inherit, not the myth of perfection, but the example of choice, not a flawless hero, but a complicated human being who, at crucial moments, made decisions that enlarged human possibility. Not someone to worship, but someone to understand. His achievements and his failures, his nobility and his compromises, the distance between what he represented and what he was. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799, in the bedchamber at Mount Vernon, surrounded by the contradictions he never resolved. But he lived long enough to establish something that outlasted contradiction. The precedent that power can be voluntary, that leaders can be temporary, that republics can work if someone is willing to show they can work by stepping aside. The Potomac flows on, the monuments stand, the Constitution endures. And the question Washington answered, what happens when power is voluntary, echoes across centuries, across continents, wherever people must choose between service and dominion, between republic and empire, between the seduction of power and the discipline of principle. He showed us the answer, not in words, but in the simple, radical, revolutionary act of walking away.